I want to tell you something else. I can't tell anyone else. Whenever I go to visit my mother, I feel like I'm visiting another world and that I don't belong there. That's a bad feeling, right? I feel like I belong somewhere else, somewhere I've not even seen yet, but I'll know it when I see it.
Hello everyone, and special salutations to my 6 subscribers. Try saying that 3 times in a row. What is up, and welcome back to my channel. I'm back with episode 2 of Who Messed Up South Africa and How, and this time it's all about the architects of Apartheid. In the last episode I covered the establishment of the colony in Southern Africa, as well as the growing social classes that emerged from the 17th to the 19th century. Of course, I'm using Alexander Parker's 2010 book 50 People Who Stuffed Up South Africa as a handy guide through history, and I'm just here to serve as a guide for the pronunciation Apartheid of South African words to the rest of the internet. In a nutshell, this video series is for those who are seriously curious about how South Africa has turned into the land of load shedding, endless racial antagonism, and an economy that has never been able to sustain all of its people. One of our former presidents recently said that the time of the ANC is coming to an end. The party that liberated South Africa from racial segregation is under threat, and there are implications around that, but we gotta start at the beginning and understand this from a historical context. Do you know who the ANC is? Do you know the behemoth they had to slay? Who made that monster? But just before I get into all of that, please consider giving this video a like if you already like what you hear. If you have some thoughts on my content or you want to bounce some ideas around, let me know. Roger Southall rightly comments, many observers of the current South Africa will wonder whether a deep dive into the history of white political parties is relevant to the current situation blamed on ANC corruption, cadre deployment, and maladministration. It is. Successive breakaways from the African National Congress reflect the inherently fractious nature of South African politics, whether it has been under white minority rule or, as now, under a democratic dispensation. It is still too early to predict the decease of the ANC, yet all the signs of terminal disease are there. It has become thoroughly corrupt, it appears unable to reform itself, and it appears increasingly unable to govern the country. But we've been there before. In fact, it seems that's where we've always been.
But the African seldom sees the gold he produces. It's white men who handle it. Gold, being precious, is a white man's metal.
At the time of Cecil John Rhodes's death, South Africa was still a loose collection of independent white settlements and displaced native peoples. Non-whites could only vote in the British-controlled Cape Colony. The British had started to settle in 1820, introducing rudimentary rights for blacks at the Cape. The resentment that the Boers felt against this social change caused them to migrate inland en masse. Rhodes had instigated the expansion of British influence into the Boer republics. It was Rhodes who first restricted the rights of the blacks in the Cape Province, and the politics of the colony came to be dominated by tensions between the British and the Boer, while the black African lost more land, resources, and political rights. Meanwhile, the Afrikaners wanted control over a territory they felt was rightly theirs. In the decades following their losses during the Anglo-Boer War, they built up their society based on the superiority of their race, as well as their bitter hatred for the English and their empire, the likes of which included Horatio Herbert Kitchener, who came to South Africa in 1899 as part of the reinforcements sent from Britain to quell the Boer uprising. In 1900, Kitchener was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Army. Around the time, his side was effectively winning the war. The Boers' last stand were the guerrilla troops keeping Afrikaner farms, as well as the women and children staying there, safe. Kitchener devised a military policy that sought to dismantle their defenses, down to every last Afrikaner, it seems. British troops laid waste to everything in their path, killing livestock, burning crops, razing farmsteads, poisoning wells, and salting fields. They also rounded up whomever they found and locked them up in internment camps. This was a military success in terms of suppressing the other side, but the British Army's concentration camps did not have the capacity to take in the tens of thousands of civilian prisoners of war. Before long, the prisoners, 280,000 of them, began to succumb to the poor conditions of overcrowding, poor hygiene, and insufficient rations. The measles, pneumonia, and dysentery took most of them. The Afrikaners would come to loathe Kitchener and the empire he represented when it turned out that he had eliminated nearly half of all Boer children. Among the dead were 20,000 black Africans who were also involved in the war. That was not the concern when news reached his superiors in Britain. Once it became known just how horribly the war was being fought, Lord Kitchener received demands that he stop meddling in Boer families. So, he adjusted the policy only slightly. His troops continued burning farms to the ground and simply left the destitute families on them. This left the already overburdened guerrillas with the responsibility of ensuring their survival as well as their own. The Boers accused Kitchener of attempted genocide because, the way they saw it, he had intentionally made the internment camps impossible to survive, but again he escaped the charges. Against Lord Milner's aggressive intentions to forcibly subjugate the Afrikaners and make them subjects of the crown, Kitchener instead suggested limited self-government for the Boer republics and arranged for a grant to aid the Boers in rebuilding their farms. The Treaty of Vereniging, meaning unity or union, was signed. The Boer Transvaal and Orange Free State became British territories, and on 31 May 1910, the Union of South Africa was born. But there was no unity. The Afrikaners were ran off their farms and into the growing metropolis of Johannesburg, taking their Anglophobia with them to compete with the black and other unskilled laborers. They never forgave Kitchener for what they saw as his ruthless focus on winning the war at all costs. For any nation to lose half its children in a matter of months would be considered a holocaust. It is that, more than anything, that still today raises fury and sorrow in Afrikaner hearts. Kitchener takes his position as the most hated man in Afrikanerdom, the archetypal Rooinek who wrought misery on the folk. Like many aristo-bureaucrats, Kitchener didn't stay long and moved on with his career abroad. An astute soldier, he foresaw that World War I would be a new kind of monster, needing huge armies to defeat Germany. It didn't take long for the Brits to forget what he'd done to the Boers, as they proudly plastered his face on army recruitment posters, likely pulling in thousands of volunteers for that cause. But the Afrikaners never forgot what Milner, Kitchener, and their like had done to them in the name of king and country. From 1910 onwards, they started work making sure their race would reap the best of what South Africa could offer. Now that all that settler colonialism war business was done and there was an actual country to fight for, the subjugation of the black African could begin true and proper. Yay, politics was buzzing in the 1910s in the newly formed Union. Political parties had affiliated newspapers to serve as their mouthpiece. There was a parliament with members, mostly elected by the white minority. Being a dominion of the British Empire, all government officials served in the name of the crown, even the Afrikaners. They went along with this for a time, electing their first prime minister, Louis Botha, based on the fact that he represented a coalition of British settler communities and white Afrikaners. Within the white minority was the even smaller group of English speakers who favored political parties in support of close relations with the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. But the Afrikaners had long been disgruntled in 1914, founding their very own national party to promote equal rights for the English and Afrikaner communities. For the blacks, they had something rather nifty in mind, but we'll get to that later. First, let's meet an ordained Dutch Reformed minister, Daniel François Malan, who was to become the answer to all the Afrikaners' troubles of self-determination and subjection to a foreign, rival crown. He was born in the Cape Colony, but left to go get a bit of an education. I'm talking degrees in maths and science, Mans had a master's in philosophy and went all out with a doctorate in divinity from Utrecht in the Netherlands, where he spent the entirety of the Second Anglo-Boer War. But he came back home in 1905, serving as minister for lots of Dutch Reformed congregations across the country. This was soon after the war, so the struggles of his people were particularly concerning for him. Afrikaans wasn't even being recognized as an official language, but Malan would see to all this, starting with his appointment as editor for Die Burger newspaper, the National Party's very own. In 1915, he became leader of the Cape Province's branch of the party, and in 1918, he was elected to Parliament. He relinquished his position as minister and started preaching the real gospel, which to him was the Afrikaner's God-given right to rule the land. Ascending to the leader of the National Party in the 1930s, Malan decided to cast the magical spell of white nationalism on his eager followers, implying that there was something auspicious about the Boer victory at the Battle of Blood River a century ago. During a speech commemorating the event, Malan declared the spot where Andries Pretorius' troops took out Dinganis in vengeance for their slain kin sacred by virtue of their blood spilled there. You stand today in your own white blood, at your own blood river, seeing the dark masses gathered, isolated white race. This philosophical wizardry by Malan was a resurrection of an old, settled score intended to pin the target of their superiority firmly and quite literally on the backs of the black population. The British, honestly, were too powerful to subjugate, so the white Afrikaner had already conceded to their inevitable merger with them. But they absolutely detested the idea of eventually being compelled to do the same with the Southern African their ancestors had tried to enslave. In 1950, 2 years after his party won the general election, Malan crystallized the philosophy behind his brand of nationalism. How did Malan mess up South Africa? Parker says it best. He gave those early Afrikaners the various ropey, made-for-purpose mythologies about the God-given right they had over South Africa that some racists still use to justify widespread bigotry today. On 8 January 1912, the South African Native National Congress was created in direct response to the systemic oppression of black South Africans at the hands of the white government. Forget all the past differences among Africans and unite in one national organization, Pixley Isaga Seme had said a year earlier. From then on, they led campaigns against laws like the 1913 Land Act and pass laws, which forced many black South Africans from their farms and lands and forced them to work in cities where their movement was controlled. They changed their name to the ANC, the African National Congress, in 1923, and this name, despite the absolute shit show on display these days, has always been synonymous with the liberation of black people in South Africa, the redress of social polarities stemming from colonial and apartheid laws, and the empowerment of all people in society. I'll give them their flowers now because some of their members might feature in future episodes. The ANC truly had a behemoth task in stopping what was to come. Malan was a somewhat tactful politician trying to appeal to a broader base, but other Afrikaners were becoming more brazen. This one was the first to openly run on a ticket of apartheid. Hendrik Verwoerd came to South Africa as a toddler when his parents moved from the Netherlands to lend a hand to the defeated Afrikaners after the war. The young HF was another astute Afrikaner academic, graduating cum laude with his doctoral thesis in philosophy. This earned him some more scholarships, and he studied under famous German psychologists and philosophers. He became professor of sociology and social work at the University of Stellenbosch and started doing social work among poor white South Africans. He was always a bit of an extremist, holding a grudge against the British due to a war he had no part in. Verwoerd was a white nationalist through and through, and he liked the National Party for its strict reservation of high-paying skill jobs for whites only. In 1948, Verwoerd was first elected to parliament, and in 1950 he became Minister of Native Affairs. Now let's get to the crux. Verwoerd ruined South Africa by funneling his Anglophobia towards a nationwide legal restructuring of the lives of black people. First, with the promulgation of the Population Registration and Group Areas Acts of 1950, he declared that South Africa was not a nation, but a collection of nations defined by their race. The law recognized race first and foremost, and the black population became further segmented into 8 ethnic subdivisions, each with their own designated homeland that they'd have to permanently live in, even if they'd never been there before. The Pass Laws Act of 1952 and the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 furthermore made it clear that there was no place for the African in the society the Afrikaners wanted to build. And then, in 1953, Verwoerd cemented the role of black people in his new South Africa. Cheap, unskilled labor, no use for a quality education. Even though Verwoerd tried to justify apartheid with philosophy and ethics, his idea of good neighborliness had nothing to do with equality, self-determination, or acceptance. It makes you wonder what kind of neighbors he grew up with.
Policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often, described as a policy of good neighborliness.
With these laws, apartheid put up shop. In 1958, he became Prime Minister and promised his electorate real barriers between black and white, and he delivered. Every town and city in South Africa today has residential neighborhoods based on race. The affluent white suburbs are separated from the poor black townships by stretches of industrial parks or just vacant land. It's normal to see black people in poverty here because it was designed to happen, but I am not joking when I tell you how sensationalized.
So you see, it's reverse apartheid.
Yeah, it's reverse apartheid nowadays.
With his education system, Verwoerd managed to destroy multiple generations of South Africa's potential, and with his strong enforcement of Bantu identities onto black people, he managed to divide them in their interests and prevent any real threat to white minority rule. He pushed through a new constitution, making South Africa a republic in 1961, and left the Commonwealth, finally freeing the Afrikaners from being British subjects. After this, he refused to meet with black ambassadors, started blocking non-whites from representing South Africa in international sports games, presenting apartheid as a coherent philosophical and moral framework. In 1962, the United Nations General Assembly asked its members to cut out all political, fiscal, and transportation ties with South Africa. In 1966, a man felt morally compelled to make Verwoerd disappear so that a change of policy would take place. He'd stabbed the Prime Minister to death in Parliament. Believe it or not, Verwoerd's work and his life are no secret, yet his name is plastered all over the country like an honorable legacy. His legacy, still a reality of life in South Africa today, still needs to be thrown out like the carpet. The laws passed against black South Africans from 1910 to the 1950s made everlasting impacts on South Africa. They were all abolished, but ask any South African and they'll tell you that their hometown does indeed have clearly white, black, colored or Indian neighborhoods. The apartheid government was incredibly swift in forcefully removing entire communities from their homes for the purpose of designating them whites-only areas. These were places usually deemed economically valuable or necessary to achieve the National Party's strategic goals. The former residents of District 6 in Cape Town still haven't been able to return to their home, even though the land has already been restituted. The responsibility for restitution, however, strangely lies with today's government. The wizards who cast the spell and their many minions have been absolved. I think this is the good neighborliness they were trying to get to. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the fabulous spending spree the National Party went on before they had to call it quits, and what exactly the ANC did that failed to make them a party capable of providing leaders. That is all I have for you in this episode. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Check out episode 1 of Who Messed Up South Africa and How. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Toodles!